Welcome to Out with Dan, the podcast that spotlights and examines the voices of LGBTQ+ authors, characters, and our allies. Together, we lift our voices and we tell our stories. I'm Dan White. Join me as I chat with this week's author. Hello and welcome back to Out with Dan. Today I'm excited to talk to Gary Goldstein about Please Come to Boston. Show us that beautiful book cover, Gary.
There we go.
I love it. I absolutely love it. Gary is a writer, a screenwriter, a playwright, and a producer. He wears a whole bunch of hats.
None on right now, but
none on right now. I loved this book. It was such a trip down memory lane for me. A bit of nostalgic look back, I would say. I would assume you would describe it the same way. So how about give the audience a setup for what this book is about?
Sure. Well, the book is set at Boston University, which is where I went to college. And it's set in 1975 and also partly in the present. So it kind of toggles back and forth, but mostly it's in the 1970s. And I picked that time because it was really a time of, a time where so much different than today, in terms of people's sexuality, in terms of how people came out, in terms of how people navigated it, how society looked at it, how one dealt with their parents and all of that. And today it's much more open, and I wouldn't say it's completely easy in any respect, but it's definitely, there's more access, there's more infrastructure, if you will, for it. And so it's a story of this college freshman, Nicky DeMarco, who is kind of agnostic about his sexuality. But when he gets to college, he realized that he's been holding something back that he didn't quite even realize that he had or knew about himself when he meets this guy named Joe, who's kind of this really friendly jock type. He's a year older than him. He's his orientation leader. And they're like polar opposites, but they get along really well. And then a third friend comes into this trio, Lori, who becomes great friends with Nicky and starts dating Joe. But the triangle sort of morphs itself into different things as Joe and Nicky kind of find themselves on the same side of the page. But Nicky is he's much more open to the navigation of this, and Joe does everything much more privately and doesn't sort of identify as anything or think of anything. And Nicky's just sort of finding himself and trying to be good to himself along the way. And it's just a story about how this sort of love triangle proceeds over the course of the first semester of this freshman year of college.
It's funny because one of the things that you capture so eloquently and brilliantly is the tension that all freshmen experience in college. There's the excitement of being away from home, being what I call free. I mean, I told somebody just last week, I would happily give up my career and go back to college if someone would pay for it, because it's the most freeing time most of us ever experience in life, because we are paying for it or someone else is paying for it, but you've got a financed utopia that's both exciting and petrifying all at the same time.
Right. Well, it's interesting because I was interviewed by the BU Daily Free Press, which is oddly the newspaper. It still exists, although it's mostly online. And I actually wrote for the paper when I was in college there. And, I was talking to somebody who was maybe 19, 20 years old. And her response was, the era may have been different that you wrote about, but the feelings are so much the same for freshmen when they're beginning college. It's because particularly the opening of the book, when Nicky is kind of finding his way in his dormitory. He's living in this giant dormitory, which is at the time was called 700 for 700 Commonwealth Avenue. It became Warren Towers, which is what it's known for now. And it's this just giant three tower, 14-story, 17-story building. And he's just navigating, just trying to find his place in this huge jungle. And all the people on the floor, and this was the first year, and when this book was written, it was the first year that the college ever had a co-ed dorm floor. And so Nicky finds himself on this co-ed floor and just navigating the friendships and the kind of intimacies of half the floor being male, half the floor being female, which was a whole other thing back then. It just sort of relates to so much of what, and you're just trying to find friends and figure out who you are and be liked. And I think everybody went through when they were in high school. You were in your category and you were at one level or another. Once you get to college, there are a million yous out there, and everybody's
Right.
starting all over again in the same place. And it's a bit of a level playing field. So it's a good time to kind of reinvent yourself and start over.
It is. I learned that besides just the freedom, you get to choose what you want to do as which classes you want to take. Whereas in high school, you have this prescribed list of classes that you have to take, whether you're in AP or whether you're in regular classes or special needs classes. It really didn't depend, but you had much more of a stricter curriculum and schedule than when you get to college. If you want to take 3 English classes or 3 math classes all in the same semester, that's on you. That's part of the excitement too, and the freedom of navigating. And then of course, our sexualities are either bursting at the seams or burbling to the top, whichever one. And then you sort of get to determine who you like. When you're in high school, I think that even in large cities, you have a neighborhood high school. So you sort of hang out with the people that you're accustomed to, maybe the ones you grew up with. When you get to college, there's every conceivable flavor, nationality, religion, non-religion, sexual orientation. It's just, it's Harper's Bazaar.
No, it's a whole different thing, and I think particularly for people who come from smaller towns. I grew up on Long Island in New York, and in a suburb, and it was not. It was a very nice place, but I wouldn't call it especially progressive or anything. It was just, it wasn't growing up in Manhattan, let's say, even though it was New York, and and going to Boston for college, which was a big city, and you were right in the city, in the middle of all of this that had so much to offer. It was a very different experience, and I think it's from people who come from smaller environments, and particularly smaller towns than I came from. Like Joe comes from a small town in the book, comes from a small town outside of Cincinnati in Kentucky. Where things are really different. It's that particular place that he's from is very northern Kentucky. It's might as well be the North, but it's still it still has its restrictions. So and Nicky himself, I have him coming from Long Island. I actually have him coming from the town next to where I grew up. I grew up in a town called Valley Stream. I had Nicky grow up in Franklin Square, which was the town next door where my high school was. And again, you see the kind of provincialism of his family and of the environment, but nothing negative about it, because this is kind of how it was back then. It was just right. It was just very different.
We also have to look at the generations before us, what our parents experienced, what our grandparents experienced, how much more closer knit I think that they were, at least for those of us from a smaller environment. You had all of this familial pressure that just kept going and going and going. And you go to college and you think you're free, but you still bring your baggage with you, whatever that baggage is,
Yeah, of course. Yeah, but I think the baggage fits in better there.
I think so too.
Place for it. Yeah.
So speaking of baggage, I will say that your description of Nicky and his roommate Monty, and watching Monty unpack, his clothes, I so clearly could see my first dorm room and my first roommate, and who, so this gives a little bit of levity, I think, for the listeners. So my very first roommate in college has been dead for nearly 10 years. And that's, occasionally I think about it and I'm like, holy cow. David was athletic, and he was like the class president of his school, and he was very popular, very well liked. And he went on to have a job as a coach in high school. His dream job. He ended up doing all the things he wanted, and yet he passed away in his early 50s. And in life, you don't know exactly what you'll get. Right. And I think that is the great hope in your book, is that we do live. Hopefully, we live long enough to find ourselves, our true selves. I do want to. You quoted E.E. Cummings at the beginning of the book. It takes courage to grow up and become who you really are. And I thought that was the perfect quote for you to use for this book, because it is definitely the crux of what you were bringing to us as readers.
Yeah, it's so much about, well, you know, it's in comparing Joe and Nicky's stories over the years and who they became, and they took very different paths, and yet 50 years later, when they reunite in Boston, they sort of land in a similar place emotionally. They both took very, very circuitous routes to get to where they were, and and that's what, you know, and that's part of this. The theme of this book is what it's like to be or not to be your authentic self, and the kind of because Joe as the kind of happy jock type, good looking, you know, happy go lucky guy. He just seemed like so much more easygoing than Nicky, who was very self conscious and really thought everything through and didn't have a tremendous amount of confidence. But over the course of that first semester, knowing Joe and befriending Lori, all the good parts of Nicky came out, and he became a much more confident person and moved his life forward in ways that ended up working for him, whether he knew it at the time or not. Where Joe, you would think, would be more easygoing about all of it, and he was the one who in over the years didn't take the same path that Nicky did, and ultimately finds himself at a much older age having to confront some of these things that he kind of shunted aside much of the time over those years. So their roles sort of reversed. Who they were in college really reverses as we meet them later on.
And I think we often see that in life. I mean, I do think that if you if you deny who you are, whomever that is, wherever on the spectrum you land up, if you deny that, if you deny yourself love, if you deny yourself the ability to grow and to go in different directions, then you will have to eventually come to terms with it at some point in life, or you'll live a pretty sad life. So,
Yeah,
and
so.
you know, so I thought that you gave them two different paths through life, but yet you gave us two people who really had an undying love or an affection for each other, which was really, really quite beautiful. But I do like the fact that in a couple of places, Nicky doesn't give Joe, he gives him grace, but he doesn't let him off the hook so easily.
Right.
He says, you know, I've reached out and I've tried, but you didn't want to try for whatever reason.
Right.
And it wasn't as if he was being condemning. He was just being honest. And that was so beautiful to read, because it's important to be honest.
Yeah, well, the part you're talking about takes place in the present time, and in the past, he always put Joe on this pedestal because Joe was this sort of godlike guy, but he was a great guy. He was just somebody everybody loved, and he was just easy to be with and fun and friendly and good looking and all that. So Nicky put him on a pedestal, but over the years realized that pedestal fell because of the fact that Nicky grew so much and there was so little communication over the years with Joe that he kind of basically lost his interest in him, and yet says that he always kind of measured the guys in his life that he met to Joe from that what was imprinted in him as an 18-year-old. And Joe's a bit of a fantasy character, essentially. I mean, I didn't know anybody like Joe. I'm not sure I even to this day have ever met anybody quite like him. So he was fun to write, but for Nicky, he was really that that Superman, basically.
I did not stay put in college, being that I had multiple roommates. I think my freshman year it was either 3 or 4 different roommates. It just, I moved in with one other roommate, and then he moved out to move in with somebody else, and then I got a new one, but I did have a Joe in my life. One of my roommates as a freshman, whatever he touched was golden. Mm-hmm. Everybody loved him. He was so incredibly nice, absolutely stunningly gorgeous, and he knew it, and not in a bad way. Uh-huh. He knew he was blessed. Mm-hmm. And then years and years later, I found him here in Los Angeles, because I'm a bit of a Googler, so I'm not a stalker, Gary. I'm one step behind. I'm a mini hoarder and a Googler, but not a stalker. So anyway, but I did find him. And we ended up going to lunch, and I was blown away by how very differently he had aged. He had aged into someone who was very less sure of himself than he had been. Yeah. He had come from a fairly large family, and I always assumed that he would be married with at least 20 children.
Mhm.
At that moment in life, he was not married. He had no children. He had been a successful attorney, but had sort of hit a few walls mentally and physically.
Mhm.
And I have since learned that he got married, moved to Hawaii, and he seems to be much happier now.
Mhm.
I stopped Googling him after a while, Gary. I'm like, okay, let the man live his life. But he was, I just remember the first time I met him, he had that kind of smile that Joe has, that
Mhm.
honestly, a darkened theater could be lit up when Paul smiled. He
Yeah.
was just amazing.
But some people peak young. Some people peak, it's the high school president or the captain of the high school football team. That's their glory day,
Yes,
and
yes.
it just doesn't get better than that. And it's very hard for them to live up to that. Other people, they start off really slow and they come into their own lives and they find that joy and that success, that emotional success, and all of that, and the confidence that they were lacking as a younger man or woman. And that's always really interesting to see, how things turn around, and you just can't count anybody out and cover.
Well, that's right. And it is a dangerous thing to try to predict the future, and it's a very dangerous thing to live in the past.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So, but you never know exactly. We don't know where we're going a lot of times in life. We certainly can't predict where someone else is going or how they will
Absolutely.
turn out. I mean, there are some people that I have run into as an adult that I have enjoyed so much more than I ever could have dreamed as a high schooler
No
or a
question.
college student, because they had came into their world. For my 20th high school reunion, a friend of mine, Raynette Smith Moore, was there. She saw me across the room, threw her arms open wide, and gave me the biggest hug I think I've ever had in my life. And it was the most genuine hug. And in that moment, she could have had my wallet, whatever she wanted, because she showed me a beauty and an honesty. And I saw her last year around New Year's, and it was the exact same way. And we've been out of high school a whole bunch of years now. So, but it was just so nice to see someone who was just so very confident in who they were and happy, and that made me confident and happy to be in her company.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I had a similar experience in November. I went to a big high school reunion of mine back in New York, and it was so inspiring and so soul satisfying. It was so great to see everybody, and even people who I wasn't close to in high school. They were great, and people were like talking about, oh, we were idiots in high school. And you realize that people have lived their lives. They've lived these incredible lives, and unfortunately, there are many of our classmates died young, on the younger side, and that's very sobering. But yeah, I just felt like, boy, we've made so much progress, and partly I felt like I wish I had been able to have felt as close to all of these people back then, not just a portion of them, but all of them, the way we were all communicating and the things that people were remembering about me and vice versa. That was just so, it was just so terrific. And it just does show that we can grow really in the right direction as we age and all of that. And it's not, we're not as imprinted in stone from the beginning as, the die is not cast as much as we think. I did want to just jump in and say that, because you brought up Monty, who's for the readers of the book, he's the Nicky's first roommate. And Monty is kind of an amalgam of a few different people, but some of his traits are based on a very good friend of mine from college, who was my roommate my junior year. And he was a great guy. He was nothing like Monty in terms of being the asshole that Monty can be. But so many interesting traits and qualities, the music, the just what he wore and all that, his background. And it was really fun to kind of pull those most kind of the most the most vivid parts of him, and then put him into a character who would give Nicky much more run for his money than my roommates did. So he was a fun character. And it's funny because so many people I went to college with, they read the book and they say, okay, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? You're not. These characters, in some cases, are complete total fabrications, like Joe, and others are. And Nicky's really not a lot like me. He's much more, I think, more intrepid than I was back then, and all of that. But there are parts of people I knew, parts of people I knew in college, people I know today that show up in these characters. But mostly they're creations. But they were fun. They were fun to create. Although like I said, there are a few characters that there are some very definite traits in. They're not the character, but some very definite traits, and they were really, really fun to write.
So music plays a lovely part in this. And I think that just like smells and taste, but I especially think music is that one thing that sticks with humans, probably more than anything else.
Yeah.
I think maybe even a little bit more than movies, even though I know how impactful both television and movies are. But I think music sets a tone for us. If you hear something, you know where you were at the time you heard it.
Yeah.
I remember the year ABC used "You're Still the One" as their theme music for a season. Every time I hear that, I'm transported to 1977. I loved that song. I loved that season on ABC, but it's the music that brought me there. And as one of your characters or two of your characters do not like Led Zeppelin, neither do I. I briefly dated a guy who was a big Led Zeppelin fan, and I thought at the beginning, this isn't going to work in the long run because I cannot listen to this often. Somebody might have to die, and it's not going to be me.
Well, it's funny. Led Zeppelin is one of those bands that back in the day I liked, and I like some of their music now. But sometimes when I listen to it, it just feels more than virtually any, and this is just my take, more than virtually any successful bands from back then, it just feels really dated. I can't, them and Jethro Tull just feel very dated to me.
Right.
That they're anything but brilliant musicians because they've been so successful and they brought so much to rock music back then. But some things don't have the staying power. And then other songs really do. But I'm a bit agnostic about Led Zeppelin more than Nicky and Laurie are, because they have, I had to give them something to bond over.
I interviewed one author who, in her book, her main character hates Elvis.
Oh.
And it turns out in real life, both she and her mother hate Elvis.
Oh, okay.
She's like, I can't stand his sound. And I'm like, when it comes Christmas time, Elvis is on first. His Christmas album is always the first one played of the season. So I'm like, but you grew up with something that's very familiar to you.
Yes.
I remember being at a party in college that Led Zeppelin was on repeat. And it was like, oh my, yeah, that party, I didn't stay at too long. It was fun though. But I did like the flavors, the smells, the sights, the sounds. I do love Boston. I didn't go to Boston University, but I do like Boston. I know where those things are. So I really felt like I was transported to my many trips to Boston. Yeah. That part was really, really fun to read because you invested a lot of Boston into the book, but you invested the feelings of Boston, the smells and the touches.
It was funny because writing the scenes that were set in the 70s, it was very easy to access those because you could I remembered a lot of them, but most of them are documented, and even if they're not, there's no way of really checking up on. I'd say 99% of what's in this book is accurate location wise and things like that. But dealing with the present day Boston, I was much more careful about because it's very easy to check it. But you have so many more tools. You can just go on Google and look at what a street looks like today and what an address and all of that. So that was fun in terms of the description. In Boston, I went to school there for 4 years. I lived there as a real person for 4 years after I graduated, and I worked there. And it was a beautiful city to live in. And I didn't have a car, and I lived in the main part of the city, but not really immediately close to any of the public transportation. So I walked everywhere, and I literally, and it was an easy city to walk. I'd walk an hour from one side to the other, and I loved doing it. And the images are so imprinted in my head about what everything looked like. So it was kind of easier to bring back. And I'm not sure living there, as much as I did like the city, I appreciated it as much as I do and would so many years later. And, living in Los Angeles, which I also love and has its, very, very positive aspects. But there's something about those Eastern cities, and as somebody who's from the Northeast myself, that really does, it's very nostalgic for me, and it really does hit home for me and the things that I feel very comfortable with in those cities. So, but it was really fun to recreate it and give some of that Boston vibe out to the readers.
It was well done, and it was, for, like I said, I have visited quite often, and I do love the city. I mean, you just really gave us a vibe for it, which was fun. And there again, that trip down memory lane for me while I was reading your work, I'm also at the same time on a parallel plane revisiting some of my college days and some of the things that I did. And like you, or at least Boston University in 1975, the drinking age was 18 when I got to college. And so by the time I got to college, drinking was already legal for me.
Yeah.
It rolled with me in North Carolina. When I was 21, it was moved to 21, but it rolled all along. So, but it was just such a different thing. And then I remembered, now I don't think at East Carolina you could smoke in the dorm rooms, but after I graduated from college and I worked for the newspaper, there was a low haze in every room of the newspaper.
Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I wasn't sure about that either. And because I remember people smoking in the rooms all the time and having some of those little machines that you blow the smoke into so it wouldn't go all over the place. And certainly people drinking beer all the time. The elevators just stunk of beer all the time. But I did check. I did a lot of research with some of the communications people who are on staff at BU these days, and they sort of went back in time for me and helped reconfirm. And they were like, "Well, there were you weren't technically allowed to drink and smoke in the dorm, but nobody stopped you." That was kind of the gist of it. Yeah.
As long as you didn't get out of hand, nobody bothered you.
Right.
So before we started recording, you told me that you had been an LGBT study editor. Is that right? What did you tell me, Gary? I'm so sorry.
I was the chair for a long time of the Writers Guild LGBTQ Writers Committee, and I was the chair of that committee for many, many years now. I'm a member of the committee, and it's a great committee. Although the Writers Guild has all these different access committees, that they have a Latino Writers Committee and what they call it's an age awareness committee for older writers. They have the committee of Black writers, women's writers, disabled writers. There's all kinds of committees, and our committee, I was there kind of as one of the founding members somewhere in the 2000s, and it was a great experience. But it's been so fascinating to see the growth in that particular committee and the diversity of the increasing diversity of the members. First, the irony is when the committee started, we were always short of women, and I would always joke and I would say, "This is the first time in my life I'm actually looking for women." We really wanted more women in the committee, and now we have many women in the committee. We have trans writers, we have non-binary writers. We have it's just so great to see how the community has expanded and expressed itself. And it's very much in this in the committee. And for people out there, the Writers Guild is the union for screenwriters. I'm a screenwriter as well as a novelist, so I've been in the Writers Guild for a long time.
That's amazing. And I do love the fact that here in Los Angeles, we're fortunate that we have a lot more inclusion in so many different ways. So many studios, most of the guilds are very inclusive. And I mean, it's good because we need all kinds of voices. There's not just one voice out there in this world. There are many voices. And as we come to Gay Pride Month, it's important that all voices are amplified, not just on Gay Pride Month, but every month. But I mean, I think especially for those of us who are gay, is so important to be seen and heard authentically.
Yeah. Well, I was very encouraged yesterday on Twitter and other social media. Virtually every professional sports team, football, baseball, hockey, ran a pro pride graphic and support, which is great. All these companies did. That's not something that you saw until more recently, and it's great that whatever slings and arrows these teams or companies have to deflect, they're doing the right thing and being supportive, which is
absolutely
great.
Absolutely. Once again, the book is Please Come to Boston. It's by Gary Goldstein, and it is so wonderful. Thank you, Gary, for being a guest.
Thanks, Dan. It was great to talk to you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for joining me for this week's episode of Out with Dan. You can find more information about this podcast and its host at OutWithDan.com, on Twitter at OutWithDan, and on Instagram and Facebook at GoOutWithDan. This podcast is hosted by Authors on the Air Global Radio Network, and the theme music is provided by bensound.com. Join us again soon for the next episode of Out with Dan.